I'm Sarah Buckley and I'm Carol's Chief of Staff and the CEO of the Trella Foundation. And there is a little glitch happening with my laptop, so apologies if there's just a little surge of volume. It should just rectify itself relatively quickly, but I just wanted to flag that. And I really did want to make sure as we gather for this event that we take a moment to reflect on the various traditional lands on which we're placed. And I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation where I am and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and of course any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here with us today. And of course to our Pathways to Politics community. We're just so proud that we've launched a national website and a digital knowledge hub in March, and it's a fantastic publicly available platform where all women and gender diverse people can find practical tools, information and inspiration to help them run for public office. So we've got curated content, and a lot of that is quite exclusive content that we've created especially for the hub. So there's interviews with alum, there's articles and there's video content. So for example, we have a new UNSW report representing care towards a more family-friendly parliament that identifies key amendments necessary to making state and federal parliaments care-friendly. The wonderful Ruth McGowan has also gifted her fantastic book, Getting Elected, to be freely available on the website. And a big thank you to the wonderful University of Melbourne team who took the lead on developing the website and Knowledge Hub and will continue to manage and support it. I also wanted to flag that our 2022 state-based programs are currently open for applicants for female identifying and non-binary residents of Victoria, Queensland and New South Wales. And as we all know, sometimes it just takes a little bit of encouragement or a prompt from a trusted source. And we've had so many excellent applications over the years that have come through Pathways referrals from alum and the broader Pathways community. And so I would love for everyone here to think of a fantastic woman to tap on the shoulder and suggest that they apply. And we've got applications open until the 26th of April. And finally, I wanted to acknowledge and celebrate the 10 alum who are running in the upcoming federal election. I'm just going to read out their names. So in Victoria, we have Mary Doyle for the seat of Aston. We have Claire Ferris-Mile for Casey, Katie Allen for Higgins, Nadia David for Indi, Zara Mustaf for Jagga Jagga, Sarah Jefford for Wills, and Susan Benedica for the Senate. And in New South Wales, we have Georgia Steele for Hughes, Sally Situ for Reid, and in Queensland, we have Denisha Duff for Bowman. And we wish them all the best, very best for the coming weeks. We're incredibly proud to have such strong representation from the Pathways alum. So we're delighted tonight to be joined by the Women's Leadership Institute Australia Fellows, Dr. Ramona Vijeyarasa and Dr. Leonora Risse, who will be unpacking how we're missing diverse women's perspectives and the impact this is having on critical decisions being made for our nation. So in preparation, I just wanted to flag it'll be recorded and made accessible to the full Pathways community. And you're very welcome to share your thoughts and comments via group chat. And once we've had the in-conversation, we'll be using the raise hand function if you have some questions. So over to you, Carol.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sarah. And as I said, I'm so excited to have Ramona and Leonora join us this evening. It's going to be a fantastic conversation. They're both incredibly talented and they're both really determined that they're going to strengthen the way governments consider policy and legislation. And we try and advocate and promote their policies and their work as much as we possibly can through the Women's Leadership Institute. So let me introduce them a little bit more formally. Dr. Leonora Risse is an economist who specialises in gender equality. She's a research fellow with the Women's Leadership Institute Australia, and we're very, very proud to have her as one of our fellows. And she spent time in residence at Harvard University as a fellow with the Women in Public Policy program, also an organisation that's very close to us. She is a co-founder of the Women in Economics Network, WEN, in Australia, and currently serves as the WEN National Chair. Now, this is a really important group that promotes the importance and significance of economics and becoming an economist to women. So it's a crucial crucial organisation. Leonora earned her PhD in economics from the University of Queensland and served as a senior research economist for the Australian Government Productivity Commission. She is currently appointed as a senior lecturer in economics at RMIT, and her research focuses on identifying evidence-based policy to close gender gaps in workforce outcomes and applying a gender lens to economic analysis and policy design. She engages regularly with government, businesses, community groups, and public audiences on gender equality issues. And Sarah and I became very, very aware of Leonora's work with government when we were involved with a panel inquiry on behalf of the Victorian government into gender equity. Her work was fantastic. Now, Dr. Ramona Vijeyarasa is the chief investigator behind the Gender Legislative Index, which is a tool combining law, engineering and data science to promote the enactment of legislation that works more effectively to improve women's lives. Now, as I said before, I was very happy to be with Ramona last week when she was acknowledged for this work. She actually received the Women in AI in the Law category award. And believe me, she was up against some pretty stiff competition, although I was convinced she was always going to be the winner. And she was also awarded second runner-up for the Women in AI Innovator of the Year. Ramona is a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Law and the Juris Doctorate Program Head and a Women's Leadership Institute Research Fellow. She is editor of International Women's Rights, Law and Gender Equality, Making the Law Work for Women, 2021, and author of Sex, Slavery and the Trafficked Women, Myths and Misconceptions about Trafficking and its Victims, in 2015. Her upcoming book, The Woman President, Leadership, Law and Legacy for Women, is based on her experiences from South and Southeast Asia, and it's going to be published by Oxford University Press later this year. So congratulations on that, Ramona. It's going to be a fabulous book. We can't wait. So just to set some context for our discussion today, we wanted to hold this event because regardless of who wins the 2022 federal election, there are pragmatic steps that could be taken to better inform broad policy and legislation design. Ramona and Leonora are going to share some fascinating insights into what is currently happening and their vision for how it could be done differently. And let's face it, we do need things to be done somewhat differently. And now, of course, this isn't about taking a partisan view, but more about how governments could more equitably reflect the needs of women and families in policy and legislation. Before we leap into exploring gender-responsive policy, budgets and legislation, I wanted to start by asking each of you, Ramona and Leonora, to share a little bit about your backgrounds. I know I have introduced you, but you're both very highly regarded as a lawyer and as an economist, respectively. So what drew you to a professional focus on gender equality? Ramona, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you for such a kind introduction and for being with me last week. It was a wonderful event. So what drew me to be a lawyer? You know, I think I was one of those people who always wanted to be a lawyer. I made a barrister's briefcase when I was 9 for a library project. You know, so it was always my destiny, I suppose. And I think I'd seen a lot of inequality around me, you know, I suppose mostly throughout my whole life. You know, my grandmother would have been a child bride when she landed in Malaysia after migrating from Sri Lanka and married my grandfather, and her sister was married into a polygamous relationship. But these were things I only came to know much later in my life. I was certainly raised by parents who had this consciousness of how valuable it would be to, you know, spend your life thinking about those with less. And I suppose that's what pushed me to leave a career in corporate law and to pursue a career in international human rights instead. And I spent about a decade working for international organisations all around the world on women's rights. I met a lot of women from all countries around the world who would often tell stories that really meant the law wasn't working for them. So there were laws in place in their countries, but it didn't accommodate their needs of the law. And I suppose that's what's led me now to look more at, how can we make law work better and for a greater diversity of women?
Thank you. That was fantastic. And Leonora, over to you.
Thanks, Carol, and thank you for the warm welcome. It's a real honour to join this group tonight. And can I just say, I applaud and commend everyone who's a part of this group, and thank you for putting yourself forward to represent your communities. This question, gosh, if I was to sum it up into one word, what drew me into the profession and focusing on gender equality, it would be curiosity. I probably was the type of young child who looked around and said, hang on, but why? Why is that the case? And I guess I had a dissatisfaction with looking at these gender differences in the world around me and not being satisfied with the explanations and the justifications that were given, that it's just women's choice or that's just the way it is. I remember when I was young, moving into our home, I must have been just about 10, and seeing, to get to the attic, there's normally, we call it the manhole, and there was this manhole and it said manhole, and I got a piece of chalk and wrote HU in front of the man. So it became a human hole. And I think right from that age, I was just like, I don't see a good justification for why we have these gender segregations or these gender norms. I found myself gravitating towards economics because it gave you the tools to interrogate, to critique, to analyse, to investigate. And at the time that I really was studying, I focused on maternity leave at the time because it was an issue that was being discussed, but there wasn't a lot of economists actually working on that issue. And so that has led me down the path of being able to use my economics and my communication skills to not just understand, but to provide constructive solutions. And I think I'm very much focused on what is the evidence, what is the research, and how can that back up the case for gender equality.
Brilliant. And we all know how crucial data and evidence is in being able to argue a case in a cogent way. So thank you both. So let's set the context as we head towards a federal election. I must say I've found it quite frustrating to see the lack of mainstream attention on female voters, both by politicians and the media. However, there is some momentum building. For example, the rise of professional female independent candidates, the think tanks and the unions pushing hard for change in areas like childcare and aged care, and groups such as Women for Progress and chief executive women publicly advocating for issues that matter to women. What are you seeing, or on the flip side, what is missing in public debate? So Leonora, let's start with you.
As you mentioned at the beginning, a lot of my work focuses on adding a gender lens to economic analysis, and that can be operationalised through gender responsive budgeting. And I think really what's missing still is an understanding that, yes, we have what we call women issues, and often we associate childcare, aged care as being the domain of women's policy issues. And at the moment, that is the case because we know that those policy areas affect women's economic opportunities so much. But also what's missing is an understanding of how every economic decision has a gender dimension to it. Our infrastructure decisions, spending on defence, on transport, all of that feeds into opportunities that differ according to men and women by virtue of the different industries that we tend to be occupying, and different household roles. So I think there's still a huge scope for policymakers and analysts and commentary to realise that that every economic decision it isn't completely gender neutral, even though we think, women drive on roads and men drive on roads. But if you are steering so much funding towards infrastructure, for instance, we know that is disproportionately going to support men's jobs. And so those industry patterns do mean there is a gender dimension. I think what's also really missing is a narrative and an understanding that expenditure on the care economy is an investment, and it does generate a return for the collective economy by way of enabling greater labour force participation, greater matching of skills, and that's often lost because it's seen simply as expenditure, and the proper analysis hasn't been put towards really recognising and appreciating the long-term economic benefits. So I think shifting that narrative to talk in terms of an investment is really crucial for understanding how the care economy is part of the foundations of a well-functioning economy that enables everyone really to participate more fully. I think
can I say one thing there, though, because
Sure.
we all know the data around early childhood education, for example, and yet it seems to be such a battle. And yet the data is there around the benefits and advantages of early childhood education right through in the individual's life, and how it sets them up for success. And yet we seem to be battling all the way, and as you say, you know, governments and the media often still cite this as a woman's issue.
Yes, it's a really challenging question, because if the data is so compelling and so convincing, then something else really is getting in the way, really, because, you know, the data really does speak for itself. I think policymakers have at their disposal the resources to be able to undertake some sort of, you know, cost benefit analysis for all their different expenditures, and so there is scope there, I think, to keep pressing for that to be elevated, to be recognised a lot more. I think sometimes it's out of convenience that a lot of the focus on expenditure on women will focus on legitimately important issues such as women's safety and women's health, and they're absolutely critical. And often that's the government's interpretation of you know, expenditure on women and supporting women, and we do need that broader perspective to understand that the care economy is an investment that's not just for women. It is generating benefits, you know, right through the economy. So I think I understand what you're saying, that it's not necessarily factored into the final decisions or to what, you know, we end up seeing in terms of their policy outcomes. There's one other thing I'd like to highlight there is also, I've noticed that the government, and it has made a lot of progress in identifying women's safety as a core issue, and also women's economic security has been set up as another portfolio. What I would highlight is the ways in which those two domains are so interlinked. So women's safety will determine women's economic security, and women's economic security will influence women's safety. So I think what we need perhaps is more of a holistic picture as well. So we're not sort of treating this as separate issues, because the research really shows that when you have these disparities in economic outcomes, when you have the incidence of violence against women, often it's traced back to the same root causes. And so actually they do all kind of fall under the same umbrella. Thanks, Carol.
So fascinating. Thanks, Leonora. So, Ramona, what are you seeing that's missing in public debate?
Look, I think Leonora's really nicely set us up to understand this problematic way in which certain issues are labelled as a policy, men's policy issue and a women's issue. You know, I suppose, you know, if you look at this is a strange way to answer this question, but I was commenting at the start of the call on how bad the weather has been in Sydney the last 3 months. And, you know, it's, as someone who's climate conscious, it really made me aware of the reality that for a woman, for example, in a coastal region in Queensland, her number one concern as a woman may be climate erosion and her housing security in the years to come. And, I think it's really about opening a conversation where we have a broader number of women at the table to be able to say, this is what matters to me as a woman. And so Leonora's right in highlighting, I suppose, some of the problematic ways in which it's too easy to pick up on certain policy issues as a women's issue and invest in those without the bigger picture. We've come off an incredibly difficult 2 years for women that have really brought visibility to issues around workplace security, sexual harassment, gender-based violence. And so it is important that we're seeing continued investments around safety. We've seen a $1.3 billion investment in the budget, which is not much of an increase from last year, I would say. But it's about really broadening the lens of and having a bigger conversation about what matters to women, because we may be missing some big pieces, especially as we're seeing it, the new dynamics of today. And I think climate and gender is one of those.
Yeah. It sort of leads me into a question that I was going to ask you later, but I want to ask it now because you both sort of talked about a bigger context that we're operating within. And I recently shared with you both some disturbing research results by Ipsos and the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. And the findings from this study indicate that gender equality still has such a long way to go in Australia. We lag behind many countries in terms of gender bias and our perceptions of what is considered acceptable behaviour. Look, I encourage everyone to have a look at the research, but I wanted to focus on a couple of findings. 1/5 of Australians agree that gender inequality doesn't really exist. Now, that means 1 in 5 Australians. Men are more than twice as likely to agree than women. That gender inequality doesn't exist. 1/4 of Australians believe that feminism does more harm than good, and 1/5 believe that men have lost in terms of economic and political power or socially as a result of feminism. Again, men are at least twice as likely to say this as women. Now, I just found this stuff incredibly shocking, and I wanted to ask you both what your reflections are on this in this current political environment. Do you have any thoughts on how we shift attitudes? Because to me, what that indicates is that we have so much work to do on the cultural issues in this country and attitudes towards women and our standing in society, that until we fix that, we're not going to get to the other stuff. So, Ramona, I might start with you this time.
Thanks, Carol. Look, it is shocking. The statistics are shocking, but I think they're also a good reminder that we can't be naive here. Sometimes I've got on my phone, I read all these news about gender equality and I think, wow, we're really attuned here, till I realise that Google News is sending me what I need to read based on an algorithm of what's of interest to me. I think we need to not live in our echo chambers of people who are really conscious about how important it is to talk about gender and know what we're up against. Why? Because I think it makes us more strategic. I think it reminds us we need to keep honing in on the message that we aren't a gender equal country and that we're one of the poorest performers among the world's wealthiest. I think it also reminds us of how strategic we need to be in our approach for change, that we need to mobilise a much greater diversity of allies, including allies with resources, that we need to work across groups and build solidarity around common agendas, because we are up against something much greater than we would otherwise realise if these kind of statistics weren't coming to us. Carol, you just mentioned then, how much cultural change is needed. We live in a country with no Human Rights Act. We live in a country with no National Gender Equality Act. And these are the kind of acts that can foster some kind of cultural ethos that we all actually want to head in the same direction, which is a gender equal nation. These statistics and that gap reminds us that maybe we don't share that cultural value and we need to foster it. So I suppose in some ways it's better to be conscious of what we're up against than assuming that everyone's on board, because I think it makes us more strategic in what we're doing.
Thank you. That was really thoughtful, Ramona. Leonora.
Thank you, Carol. When I saw those results, initially, I admit, I thought, oh, maybe the methodology is not reliable. So they are shocking. But then I went and I cross-checked it against the Hilda survey data, and it's pretty on par with what we find from Hilda. For instance, 18% of Australians agree it is better for men to be the breadwinner and for women to look after the household and children. So I think it actually is consistent with other surveys. Look, many of us here, we're attuned to a need for change. We recognise the potential benefits by changing the current system. And when you work in public policy, you have to also realise there's a large contingent of the population and people in power who have a really good reason not to change anything. We can put forward our case for change, but there's just as solid a case out there for why things shouldn't change, particularly when it comes to gender equality. And what we're asking of people is to shift social norms, social patterns, social stereotypes. And you have to then think, why do these stereotypes exist? And in my studies in economics, I found myself being more enlightened when I look at the literature from sociology that talks about how social norms provide basically like a safety blanket for a lot of people. They provide a sense of identity and certainty. So you can understand why certain people in society will grow up in a culture, in an environment where they see these social stereotypes that this is the role for women and this is the role for men. And it does provide a sense of comfort and achievement if they can aspire to and accomplish and fulfill those roles. And it comes under threat when we suggest that we want to dismantle those sort of gender patterns. And it's not just men, but also many women who feel destabilized by that because they really want to embrace, those traditional gender norms. So I think some mindfulness about where does that allegiance to traditional social stereotypes emanate from, and why are people hanging on to it? What is the sense of sort of psychological safety that those norms provide for them? And then that helps us to, I guess, navigate it through a way of explaining how we're pushing for an expansion of opportunities, but we're not necessarily, threatening or harming the things that they're holding on to as well. It's more of an expansion of opportunities rather than a replacement or a displacement. So I think understanding that the personal psychological aspect is important because there is resistance. There's absolutely ideological resistance, psychological resistance at an individual stage, at an organisational level, at a government level. Those who want to conserve current structures, power structures, structures that preserve existing power and privilege, and those of us that do want to push for an expansion. So it is actually a fascinating issue in and of itself to explore, but also to be really mindful of and not to make assumptions that everybody is just going to join in and be have the same vision.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I have spoken to a number of different politicians about this report and said they've got to read it and read it very carefully because we have a lot of cultural work that needs to be addressed.
Carol, can I add one more thing there? This is where the data and evidence really is needed, because you could say to people, what's wrong with these stereotypes? What's wrong with women staying at home and men being in positions of leadership? But what we also know from the research is that men who are prescribed to or follow or feel they believe in these traditional norms generally experience worse outcomes in life in terms of mental health, stress, suicide ideation, risk-taking. And so those traditional stereotypes are associated with worse outcomes, greater rates of harassment against women. So we do have the evidence there to sort of push for why social change is justified as well.
Good. I like that. I'm going to quote you on that. I know you are both huge advocates for applying an intersectional lens. Ramona, what does this actually mean in a practical sense, and Why is it such a gap currently?
It's a great question, Carol. I was speaking on a panel recently with a family law professor and a female senator on intersectionality, and we got to the end and an audience member said, I didn't actually know what intersectionality means, but I sort of understand it now. So I think we throw the term around without actually defining it very often. And just, to not get into the academics, but its history is from the 1980s, late 1980s in the US, where a brilliant Black feminist legal scholar, Kimberly Crenshaw, started talking about intersectionality. And she changed the nature of race relations in the US by reminding people that Black women in the US have a very particular experience of inequality that was different from Black men or different from white women, and how you need to acknowledge people's multiple identities. So fast forward to Australia today, it's about recognising how race, age, class, marital status, ability, whether you're from a non-English speaking background, are all going to affect how you experience life. Your access to housing, whether you enjoy the benefits of government policy, whether you're more likely to be picked up by police, whether you're more likely to suffer from discrimination at work, and whether you're going to have the skills and access to the resources to do something about it. So, it's so essential because it really shows who are those being left behind in our society and who are not being accounted for in terms of policy, law, or budgeting. Why I think this might be the case, I think we just don't have enough diversity in leadership for there to be a consciousness in decision-making. And when I say leadership, I mean across the board. But just if I were to speak from a legal lens, if you don't have lawmakers, and I'm talking the people who draft the laws, Parliamentary Council, who are diverse and are dominated instead by, frankly, white men from Anglo-Saxon backgrounds, there's not going to be a consciousness when you write laws about how different people are going to experience those laws. And so, I think if you don't have diversity in leadership in business, media, politics, there's less consciousness of how different people experience society. And that is naturally going to affect how we write policies, how we write laws, how we enact those laws, and what we budget for at the end of the day.
Yeah, fascinating. I remember being told once by a woman who worked in tech that in the business she was in, they were trialling a particular product which turned out to be a complete failure. And why did it turn out to be a complete failure? They had, on the testing panel, they had no one who was left-handed.
And you know what? It's such a fascinating example, Carol, because it's exactly the same issue in a lot of health decision-making. So a lot of the trials around medication and interventions, and it would be interesting to know if COVID was any different, are often made with men. And so there's the consequences there of a lot of medical trials for women are just not on the consciousness because they're not part of those trials. So it's a similar example to the one you raised.
That's right. And that's why, we get the same dosage of Panadol as men do, notwithstanding it was probably not tested on women at all. Interesting. We could talk about that stuff for ages. Leonora, you interestingly titled your recent article in The Conversation, "Applying a Gender Lens to the Budget is Not About Pitting Women Against Men." I know you advise governments in this space, and why do you think that this distinction needed to be made, and how do you frame the message when engaging with government and politicians?
Thanks, Carol. Yes, I mean, that title really was it was generated because it was about preempting the possibility that when you put forward a proposal or a case for why we need a gender lens, it can be misunderstood or it can be dismissed or critiqued unduly because it's seen as competing for the resources that have traditionally been allocated to the male sort of concentrated sectors or parts of the budget. So I think that title and the essence of the article was there to reassure and to, I guess, try to invite more buy-in and acceptance of the concept itself, and to clarify this isn't about women competing against men, and that creates obviously an antagonistic space that really is not necessarily constructive. So it was about, and I guess, anticipating that gender lensing can be interpreted as sort of women's list of demands or list of requests, but actually gender lensing and gender responsive budgeting is a tool, an objective tool to instill more robustness into your policy making process, in the same way that you would, for instance, conduct an environmental impact assessment before you decide on a final policy. So it is a mechanism, a process of improving your policy making procedure and evaluations, rather than simply pushing for a feminist agenda. In fact, if you apply gender lensing to some policy context, it is very conceivable to identify examples of policy that work against gender equality by way of disadvantaging men. And one example is the way that, paid parental leave has been designed in the past to really focus on the assumption that women were the primary caregiver and squeezing men out of the picture. So there are examples there of basically the way that policy can perpetuate gender norms and gender stereotypes. So coming back to those social roles, and gender lensing is about analysing those policies and thinking about, is it shifting those entrenched gender patterns, both amongst men and women and people of all genders.
That's actually a great lead-in to the next question I'm going to ask you, because as you both know and you both acknowledge, the audience is made up of really amazing Pathways alums. So these are women who are thinking very, very seriously about a career as politicians. 10 are running in the federal election, and at least 10 more will put themselves forward in the Victorian election, and hopefully many more of them will run for office in the coming years. They will receive a myriad of policy ideas from their advisors, their parties, and the range of lobbyists. How do you advise them to sift through the content and explore with a gender lens? And what questions should they be asking, and what should they be considering? Leonora, let's start with you.
Thanks, Carol. Oh, look, I'm excited for all these women who are in this position, but I understand how daunting or overwhelming it must be to be bombarded by all these proposals or suggestions. And I can only imagine that you would need some sort of principles-based sort of guidance to go by. I often find myself, when I'm in discussions about gender equality, people will ask, well, what is the outcome? What are we looking for? What is the end goal here? Is it 50-50 representation at the end of the day across all outcomes? And I think when you start to explore processes like gender responsive budgeting, what you find it is more about the process. Is the process that leads to your outcome one that is gender equitable, one that is free of bias? So I would imagine if you are navigating potential policies, part of your thought process is, do I have an end outcome in mind, or am I here to introduce some sort of principle to the decision-making process or the evaluation process? And gender responsive budgeting is one example of the instilling gender equity into the mechanism, as opposed to having your focus set purely on an outcome. So I would imagine if I were navigating proposals, I would be looking for, if I was interested in advancing gender equality, I would be looking for the mechanisms that are challenging and dismantling existing gender biases, and doing so in a way that is incentivizing and rewarding a shift in behaviour and patterns that will ultimately mean that people's decisions are not influenced by gender norms or gender expectations, but are truly up to them to decide. I think part of navigating gender equality policies is also being ready for critique amongst the public that this is all just woke culture, and dismissing it. And it can be a hard balance to know what to campaign for or what to push for, I imagine, or what to propose, but then to be ready to support that. And how do you handle the critique that this is just political correctness, or this is less important than other economic matters? And so I think equipping yourself, empowering yourself with those evidence and that those statistics, the factual findings there, hopefully is part of your armour there to navigate, but also to solidify your case when you do find yourself engaging in possibly some contentious debates as well.
Ramona, how would you advise a political aspirant?
Well, I suppose I'll start where Leonora did, which was she talked about the end goal. And, I do hope you want to be gender equality advocates if you get there, knowing how hard that is to be. And I suppose I'm going to play devil's advocate to Leonora, because sometimes you do want to argue, because it's safe to do so, that we aren't pitting women against men. But at the end of the day, the piece of the pie, the power pie, doesn't grow. So we do want to shift power, and the size of the resources are also not going to grow. So it is about reallocating resources in a way that may be taking some of those resources away from men towards women, and finding comfort with that. And to me, it's about saying, maybe it's time the pendulum swings the other way, because it's sat for so long at one side, and finding a way to be comfortable with that as women, if you're successful in this endeavour. I think it really is important. Leonora said about a structured way to do this. And I suppose this is why our agendas around budgeting and legislation work so well. I do think it is about being structured in how we look at policy and how to bring a gendered lens, which is what I do with the Gender Legislative Index. There's a very structured set of questions to ask to make laws gender responsive. There's questions you can ask if you're a drafter of a bill to say, will this law achieve progress for women? And I think structure is a good way to go about it. I suppose the last thing I would add, in terms of my work on gender responsive legislation, is to go beyond, the gender usuals. And we talked a little bit already about women's safety, paid parental leave, a little on climate change. I think women's financial security is a huge part of the change that needs to happen in this country, because it speaks to how women are suffering from a life cycle of inequality. In this country, we are Australia alongside the US are the only two rich countries in the world that don't tie superannuation to paid parental leave. And I think that's driving forward a lot of financial security. So what do I mean by that? Our government provides 18 weeks of paid parental leave at minimum wage, but there's no a 10% superannuation guarantee that comes along with that. Whereas every other OECD nation besides the US acknowledges that there is a relation, there has to be some sort of acknowledgement of the time women spend on paid parental leave when calculating superannuation. So what does that mean? It means that women who do choose to have children have lower superannuation. It drives financial insecurity. And today we're seeing more women, older women, with homelessness. You've got this life cycle pattern of financial insecurity that we're creating. So I suppose in sifting through all these policy options, it's can we think outside the gender usuals and to bring into the conversation issues around financial security and think about the life cycle of inequality that women might be experiencing because of the nature of our laws and policies.
Yeah, well, maybe if more men started taking paid parental leave, we would find that superannuation would actually be added into the equation. Ramona, if you were in charge of the federal budget, what would be the one major reform you would focus on to strengthen women's equity?
I love this question, and I imagine Leonora will say the same thing because we've said it already, and one has to be free public early learning. It is outrageous in this country that we don't have it, and it has a huge impact on children, and the evidence shows how important early learning is for children, but it also has a massive impact on women. Women still have to make a decision between choosing to stay home or going back to work because childcare is so unaffordable. And there's so many good models overseas where this is being done well, and we know our government can afford it. So I'd say 1, free public early education, and 2, a complete overhaul of the paid parental leave system. It will never shift practice. Carol, your question earlier talked so much about ingrained inequality and acknowledgement among men in particular, that we are a gender unequal country. These practices won't change if our policies encourage inequality. So we need to completely overhaul paid parental leave, and there needs to be what other countries call a daddy quota, a generous, flexible portion of leave given to men that is use it or lose it. Otherwise, we won't see a change in practice. So they would be the two things I would do, Carol.
Brilliant. Thank you. And Leonora, same question to you.
Well, I like the word reform because it means you can go big. This isn't just one policy. So I think for me, it makes sense that if you implement gender responsive budgeting as a process, then you've got the system set up so it's not just one issue you're dealing with, but you've got the tools to be able to bring that gender equity principle to all your forthcoming decisions and evaluations. So I think it's a bit like the genie asking for another wish, because it's just the gift that will keep giving, in a sense. I think if I'm allowed to expand a little bit on beyond just one major reform, I think if there was one particular policy area, this is so hard to bring down to, to distill down to one area, because women's violence is a crisis. Violence against women is a crisis. The rising rate of women reaching retirement age and facing homelessness and poverty is a crisis that is not on the agenda. And then at the aged care and the care sector. And so I'm thinking back to, how do you shift those norms and the sense of valuing these topics and these issues and really caring enough about them that you want to make change. And I think that based on the research and the evidence, it takes me back actually to this exact same thing that Ramona and Carol have said about bringing men into the caring realm, into the caring fold. And paid parental leave is a way to do that. By setting a dedicated quota to men. The research overseas shows that is what triggers the change, and leaving it up to households to decide if it's not allocated by roles, then it's just women who end up taking the leave, and it just perpetuates this norm. But why that's important is because it brings men into the caring space. It gives them a sense of what care is about. It legitimizes men as carers in the unpaid space, which can then spill out into legitimizing men as carers in the paid workforce, which is going to be so critical for supplying our aged care workforce, our childcare workforce, our early learning workforce. We're going to need more and more workers, quality workers, but also role models for the people, the children in those areas. So I see it as a potential domino effect. You can start to shift that norm, and then it can have these spillover effects which help to elevate care in our society, bringing about, for instance, super higher wages for care workers, because men get a taste of what it is and are rewarded for aspiring to be a carer. I think it's shifting aspirations that is one of the key levers that we need to be aiming for.
Brilliant. Let's hope that whatever new government we have in place employs you two as senior policy advisors. I think we'd be doing very, very well if that happened. Ramona and Leonora, thank you so much. It's been an absolutely fantastic conversation.